Well, good evening to everyone. It's great to be back with you. I am recording this ahead of time. So, yes, it's live, but I'm also recording it ahead of time because we have some storms in the area. And candidly, I'm just so tired of not only the storms, but also the issues that I've had the past couple weeks. And I'm starting to feel like there might be some demons here along the way that are just trying to get in the way. So, I wanted to make sure I could record this ahead of time at least, just in case the storms kicked in. Right at the moment. They're supposed to hit right at the time that we were supposed to go live, so I went ahead and did this ahead of time. So I miss you. I love you all. I'm so glad you're here. If you're watching after the fact, grateful for your presence and the rest. With that in mind, let's dive straight into letters 18, 19, and 20 on this evening. So letter 18 starts off by saying this. My dear Wormwood, even under Slubgob, you must have learned at college the routine technique of sexual temptation, and since, for us spirits, this whole subject is one of considerable tedium, though necessary as part of our training, I will pass it over. But on the larger issues involved, I think you have a good deal to learn. So just a quick note, and this is kind of fascinating, this idea that they go to school, like there's a university, a college in essence, where you can be trained to do these things, and that there's a demon college, in some ways is a little bit too close to reality for me in some of my experiences on secular campuses. And colleges in general, where can you be trained to do these things, to think these ways, to do this? Well, there's this creative world that Lewis creates that actually kind of hints at this kind of very premise. And also note that he's making a distinction between the spiritual beings and sexuality specifically for humans. And that's going to be a key component to this tonight. The enemy's demand on humans takes the form of a dilemma, either complete abstinence or unmitigated monogamy. Ever since our father's first great victory, we have rendered the former very difficult to them. The latter, for the last few centuries, we have been closing up as a way of escape. We have done this through the poets and novelists by persuading the humans that a curious and usually short-lived experience, which they call being in love, is the only respectable ground for marriage. That marriage can and ought to render this excitement permanent, and that a marriage which does not do so is no longer binding. This idea is our parody of an idea that came from the enemy. So do note kind of what he's hinting at here. It's the very essence of this idea that marriage must always feel like it did at the beginning. That love, the emotional aspect of love, is paramount above all things. And that's what he's hinting at. And that's what we have to kind of get in our own minds, that that's not how it's been historically. In fact, I can think of quite a few cultures still to this day, even modern-day India and some other cultures, where marriage is not about love. Automatically, there are love arrangements and so forth, but that the emotion of love is not the paramount thing. It's not the ultimate thing. If you look at our current culture, the way you feel, who you love is love, all of those premises are at the height of what the person most desires and what should they most desire. And I feel, in fact, it's spot on with what Screwtape is actually speaking of. The whole philosophy of hell rests on recognition of the axiom that one thing is not another thing, and especially that one self is not another self. My good is my good and your good is yours. What one gains, another loses. Even an inanimate object is what it is by excluding all other objects from the space it occupies. If it expands, it does so by thrusting other objects aside or by absorbing them. A self does the same. With beasts, the absorption takes the form of eating. For us, it means the sucking of will and freedom out of a weaker self into a stronger. To be means to be in competition. Now, the enemy's philosophy is nothing more nor less than one continued attempt to evade this very obvious truth. He aims at contradiction. Things are to be many, yet somehow also one. The good of one self is to be the good of another. This impossibility he calls love, and in this same monotonous panacea can be detected under all he does, and even all he is or claims to be. Thus he is not content, even himself, to be a sheer arithmetical unity. He claims to be three as well as one, in order that this nonsense about love may find a foothold in his own nature. So over and over again, here he's talking about this impossibility. These demons are talking about this impossibility of the idea that one cannot be about themselves, that instead one should always be about what they want, what their desires are, and the idea of doing something for someone else, or the idea of doing something for the community or for the betterment of others, is antithetical to the very premise of existence, and that God himself has been trying to confuse this by even stating that he himself is three in one, that the Son and the Father do live and work in different ways, and the Spirit and so forth. And this whole premise he's trying to confuse, in essence, the believer to think that no, the ultimate reality is that oneself is what really matters. At the other end of the scale, he introduces into matter that obscene invention, the organism, in which the parts are perverted from their natural destiny of competition and made to cooperate. So here he's going to really dive into that notion. His real motive for fixing on sex as the method of reproduction among humans is only too apparent from the use he has made of it. Sex might have been, from our point of view, quite innocent. It might have been merely one more mode in which a stronger self preyed upon a weaker, as it is indeed among the spiders, where the bride concludes her nuptials by eating her groom. So here he's noting kind of like the existence of the realm of spiders and animals and the rest, and how some, in fact, after, specifically spiders, will eat their groom after they have sex and the rest. And it's a fascinating notion that he's saying this actually makes quite more sense. But in the humans, the enemy has gratuitously associated affection between the parties with sexual desire. He has also made the offspring dependent on the parents and given the parents an impulse to support it, thus producing the family, which is like the organism, only worse. For the members are more distinct, yet also united in a more conscious and responsible way. The whole thing, in fact, turns out to be simply one more device for dragging in love. And in fact, this whole concept of uniting the family, of making three into one, when you have a father, a mother, and then a child and the rest, this whole premise of unity, of something beyond just yourself, is what he's saying is dangerous and they should avoid. Now comes the joke. The enemy described a married couple as one flesh. He did not say a happily married couple or a couple who married because they were in love, but you can make the humans ignore that. You can also make them forget that the man they call Paul did not confine it to married couples. Mere copulation for him makes one flesh. You can thus get the humans to accept as rhetorical eulogies of being in love what were in fact plain descriptions of the real significance of sexual intercourse. The truth is that wherever a man lies with a woman, there, whether they like it or not, a transcendental relation is set up between them, which must be eternally enjoyed or internally endured. And this is a fascinating notion, especially with God's original design, God's original distinction of what he desired for mankind, for man and for woman and the rest, was this eternal bond that even the very premise of I believe it's in the Old Testament concept of the Hebrew with the word dode, I believe is what it is. I could be wrong about that. Dode is this premise of the mingling of souls, is that there are eternal souls in those scenarios, not merely physical bodies playing something out in a bedroom or something like that. From the true statement that this transcendental relation was intended to produce, and if obediently entered into, too often will produce affection and the family, humans can be made to infer the false belief that the blend of affection, fear, and desire, which they call being in love, is the only thing that makes marriage either happy or holy. The error is easy to produce because being in love does very often in Western Europe precede marriages which are made in obedience to the enemy's design. That is, with the intention of fidelity, fertility, and goodwill. Just as religious emotion very often, but not always, attends conversion. In other words, the humans are to be encouraged to regard as the basis for marriage a highly colored and distorted version of something the enemy really promises as its result. Two advantages follow. In the first place, humans who have not the gift of continence can be deterred from seeking marriage as absolution because they do not find themselves in love. And thanks to us, the idea of marrying with any other motive seems to them as low and cynical. boy, if I were to take a moment and just talk about our own culture, about how we find ourselves within our world, and you see so many people say, well, I just don't love anyone and the rest, that we don't even see the cultural value of marrying someone out of the promise of what it means to abide and to love and to respect, because we think that love is only the emotion as opposed to the choice that one makes each and every day. And that the feelings may come and go, and you see our divorce rates, you see the things skyrocket, but instead of actually looking at what is best for you as an individual, for a woman to marry and to be provided for a husband to marry and to provide for, even to say those words out loud like that, where a woman is to be provided for and a man is to provide, is countercultural, when in reality it is the very thing that people still desire in the end. Even those who balk at the very concept of marriage, say, I'm independent, I can do what I want, and the rest, if they enter into a marriage, desire to be provided for. That this is natural, in fact, and it's not that men who are providing don't also wish to be provided for, don't also wish to be taken care of, to be responded to. And so there's this balance has been thrown out of whack to where all we do is marry for the idea of love. I mean, there have been entire political campaigns, there have been entire movements within our culture within the last 30, 40 years around the very notion of love. Love is love. All of that is the very premise of it, where why in the world should you stop someone from doing something or with someone that they love, as if that was the paramount of all happiness, the paramount of all things, instead of, is it actually good for you or not, which is what Lewis is actually getting at. Yes, they think that. They regard the intention of loyalty to a partnership for mutual help, for the preservation of chastity, and for the transmission of life as something lower than a storm of emotion. Don't neglect to make your man think the marriage service very offensive. In the second place, any sexual infatuation, whatever, so long as it intends marriage, will be regarded as love, and love will be held to excuse a man from all the guilt and to protect him from all the consequences of marrying a heathen, a fool, or a wanton. But more of this in my next. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. And so he really hints in on this. And so maybe that's a conversation to be had, is this very notion of what it means to actually, truly love someone, but also what it means to be in a committed relationship for the betterment of your family, your children, and the rest, and what it means to be committed, and what it means to love openly, but also in service. And especially when you look at our culture, this is unbelievably countercultural. But it's also, if you look at our culture is actively living out what Screwtape is actually teaching to Wormwood. It is the exact very premise of what is happening. Let's dive in to letter 19. My dear Wormwood, I have been thinking very hard about the question in your last letter. If, as I have clearly shown, all selves are by their very nature in competition, and therefore the enemy's idea of love is a contradiction in terms, what becomes of my reiterated warning that he really loves the human vermin, and really desires their freedom and continued existence? I hope, my dear boy, you have not shown my letters to anyone. This is a fascinating little note. I like this because it seems like he's got this worry coming out. Notice this. Not that it matters, of course. Anyone would see that the appearance of heresy into which I have fallen is purely accidental. By the way, I hope you understood, too, that some apparently uncomplimentary references to Slubgob were purely jocular. I really have the highest respect for him. And, of course, some things I said about not shielding you from the authorities were not seriously meant. You can trust me to look after your interests, but do keep everything under lock and key. That there is this, I don't use the word humanity, this little play on humanity in some ways, this play on his very real self, the looking after the self, I think goes back to the very notion of self-preservation, that is looking after himself. So in the same way while he is actually trying to support his nephew, he's also realizing that some of the things he's written could be taken and used against him, and so he's kind of hedging his bets in here. So he's kind of playing off the very thing he claims that he believes, that, hey, we're all out for our own, even though I'm helping you, by the way, but just in case this were to fall into hands, this is something I want to put in here. Slubgob, he's a good guy. All of it was in jest. And none of this is real. By the way, hide all these letters. And he kind of notes that in that way. The truth is, I slipped by mere carelessness into saying that the enemy really loves the humans. That, of course, is an impossibility. He is one being. They are distinct from him. Their good cannot be his. All his talk about love must be a disguise for something else. He must have some real motive for creating them and taking so much trouble about them. So now there's this idea of a secret motive. The reason one comes to talk as if he really had this impossible love is our utter failure to find out that real motive. What does he stand to make out of them? That is the insoluble question. I do not see that it can do any harm to tell you that this very problem was a chief cause of our father's quarrel with the enemy. When the creation of man was first mooted, and when, even at that stage, the enemy freely confessed that he foresaw a certain episode about a cross, our father very naturally sought an interview and asked for an explanation. The enemy gave no reply except to produce the cock and bull story about disinterested love which he had been circulating ever since. This our father naturally could not accept. So here he's talking about Satan coming before the presence of God, basically saying, who are these creatures and why in the world do you have them here? What do you mean that you love them and this was very good when you created them? How could that possibly be? He implored the enemy to lay his cards on the table and gave him every opportunity. So now he's making it seem like Satan, the devil, was sitting there going, come on, God, tell us what this is really all about. Just lay it all out there. He admitted that he felt a real anxiety to know the secret. The enemy replied, I wish with all my heart that you did. It was, I imagine, at this stage in the interview that our father's disgust at such an unprovoked lack of confidence caused him to remove himself an infinite distance from the presence with a suddenness which has given rise to the ridiculous enemy story that he was forcibly thrown out of heaven. And I love this because it's counterintuitive in the way he writes it. It's written as if, oh, Satan was so aggrieved at this idea that he would question him and so forth, that he left with such violence that it actually has risen to the story that God cast him out of heaven. And so he's kind of playing off, making it seem like Satan himself and the devil is a good thing, was actually just reacting to God. It wasn't God who tossed him out, it was him. Since then, we have begun to see why our oppressor was so secretive. His throne depends on the secret. Members of his faction have frequently admitted that if ever we came to understand what he means by love, the war would be over and we should re-enter heaven. And there lies the great task. We know that he cannot really love. Nobody can. It doesn't make sense. If we could only found out what he is really up to. So this entire idea of the mysteries of God and how he could ever love such creatures, there's got to be something more. There's no way he could love these little mud creatures, these little vermin, as he often calls them. Hypothesis after hypothesis has been tried, and still we can't find out. Yet we must never lose hope. More and more complicated theories, fuller and fuller, collections of data, richer rewards for researchers who make progress, more and more terrible punishments for those who fail. All this pursued and accelerated to the very end of time cannot surely fail to succeed. That they are all about trying to find out what we, and I would say us in this world, know. Those of us who walk with God, who understand that God's word and the rest, that we have come to the realization that when God said that God is love and that God is three, this very notion that when we serve others, we serve him, that when we seek his will and seek his desires, that we walk in the light, that this is what has been obscured from these devils. You complain that my last letter does not make it clear whether I regard being in love as a desirable state for a human or not. But really, Wormwood, that is the sort of question one expects them to ask. Leave them to discuss whether love or patriotism or celibacy or candles on altars or teetotalism or education are good or bad. Can't you see there's no answer? This is a fascinating notion. Nothing matters at all except the tendency of a given state of mind in given circumstances to move a particular patient at a particular moment nearer to the enemy or nearer to us. So in essence, he's getting to this very premise of all things. And you look at Scripture, that not all things are made for good, but not all things are good for us. Not all things that are in the life are ultimately going to be something good for us. That there are parameters and that there are things that we must be careful about along the way. And sex in and of itself, in the way that it was created, is something beautiful and desirable and wonderful, but outside of its confines and the rest can absolutely condemn us, can damn us in those ways, and we just don't see those connections. We just don't see the way that this plays itself out. Thus, it would be quite a good thing to make the patient decide that love is good or bad. If he is an arrogant man, which I contempt for the body really based on delicacy, but mistaken by him for purity, and one who takes pleasure in flouting what most of his fellows approve, by all means let him decide against love. Instill into him an overweening asceticism, and then, when you have separated his sexuality from all that might humanize it, weigh in on him with it in some much more brutal and cynical form. If, on the other hand, he is an emotional, gullible man, feed him on minor poets and fifth-rate novelists of the old school until you have made him believe that love is both irresistible and somehow intrinsically meritorious. That to find a soulmate. Think about all our movies that are just this idea of soulmates or constant passion. I'm thinking of like The Notebook and things of that nature that feed us this constant cynical notion of love and the emotion and the passion and the desire and the rest as the ultimate reach of all things. And if I don't feel that way, then obviously I'm not in love. Or if I don't feel that way, then I couldn't possibly love this person. That we don't actually think about the day-to-day aspects of our lives. This belief is not much help, I grant you, in producing casual unchastity. Now notice this is fascinating. But it is an incomparable recipe for prolonged, noble, romantic, tragic adulteries, ending, if all goes well, in murders and suicides. So imagine you have a person who is married, who provides for their family, but then they suddenly are swept up in moments of passion with one specific person that leads to adulteries, and it's well, I really love them. I don't love my spouse, but I really love them. And how many times you've seen these adulteries that are spoken of in such a way, well, I never really loved my husband, or I never really loved my wife, and I just really wanted this. That actually end, we see this all the time, in horrible tragedies, murders, suicides, all sorts of tragedy. There are whole entire genres of films and movies and murder podcasts and the rest that are based around this very notion that this demon kind of portrays and lays out. Failing that, it can be used to steer the patient into a useful marriage. For marriage, though the enemy's invention, has its uses. There must be several young women in your patient's neighborhood who would render the Christian life intensely difficult to him if only he could persuade him to marry one of them. Now, this is an interesting thought. Please send me a report on this when you're next write. In the meantime, get it quite clear in your own mind that this state of falling in love is not in itself necessarily favorable either to us or to the other side. It is simply an occasion which we and the enemy are both trying to exploit. Like most of the other things which humans are excited about, such as health and sickness, age or youth, or war and peace, it is, from the point of view of the spiritual life, mainly raw material. And I go back to, I think of the scriptures, there is a time for war and a time for peace, a time for planting and a time for harvest, that there's a time for all of these things, and so often we find them as wrong, right, good or bad, and so forth, instead of seeing that there is a time for all things. Letter 20, let's dive in. My dear Wormwood, I note with great displeasure that the enemy has, for the time being, put a forcible end to your direct attacks on the patient's chastity. You ought to have known that he always does in the end, and you ought to have stopped before you reached that stage. For as things are, your man has now discovered the dangerous truth that these attacks don't last forever. Consequently, you cannot use again what is, after all, our best weapon, the belief of ignorant humans that there is no hope of getting rid of us except by yielding. Now, this is a crafty little notion here. How often we think that it's always going to be there, that something's always going to be, instead that nothing can be overcome, in essence. That it doesn't necessarily mean that there's not going to be addictions, temptations, and so forth, but that the only way through them is to yield to them or give in to them and instead being able to overcome them. I suppose you've tried persuading that chastity is unhealthy. Now, this is a fascinating notion because there's a whole trend within the writings of a lot of people that are in the social sciences, but specifically in the social sciences that deal with sexuality and gender and the rest, who actually write heavily on that chastity is actually physically unhealthy for a person. Fascinating notion how all these things play themselves out 70 years later. I haven't yet got a report from you on young women in the neighborhood. I should like it at once, for if we can't use his sexuality to make him unchaste, we must try to use it for the promotion of a desirable marriage. In the meantime, I would like to give you some hint about the type of woman. I mean the physical type, which he should be encouraged to fall in love with if falling in love is the best we can manage. This goes back to the previous letters. In a rough and ready way, of course, this question is decided for us by spirits far deeper down in the lowerarchy than you and I. It is the business of these great masters to produce in every age a general misdirection of what may be called sexual taste. This they do by working through the small circle of popular artists, dressmakers, actresses, and advertisers who determine the fashionable type. Actors, musicians, music, things like that, and so forth. TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, how about the word influencers and the rest on this? The aim is to guide each sex away from those members of the other with whom spiritually helpful, happy, and fertile marriages are most likely. Thus, we have now, for many centuries, triumphed over nature to the extent of making certain secondary characteristics of the male, such as the beard, disagreeable to nearly all the females, and there is more in that than you might suppose. Now, this is a fascinating thing as a man who has a beard, for the rest, that there was generations where beard was like the thing, and then we went through a generation where not having a beard, like to be manly, to be clean shaven, meant that you were more of a man, and so forth. And now we've kind of gone back to the other aspect of this in some ways, and instead of it being a desire, and this is what he's actually joking about, was we made the idea that a man would even have a beard to be completely disregarded by women. It's just not fashionable. As regards the male taste, we have varied a good deal. At one time, we have directed it to the statuesque and aristocratic type of beauty, mixing men's vanity with their desires and encouraging the race to breed chiefly from the most arrogant and prodigal women. At another, we have selected an exaggeratedly feminine type, faint and languishing, so that folly and cowardice and all the general falseness and littleness of mind which go with them shall be at a premium. At present, we are on the opposite tack. So this is kind of a dangerous place to go into, but if you were to just think about the standards of beauty in our modern culture and the way that it's playing itself out, what is it that is most seen as like the standards of beauty? Is it the mind of a person, or is it the physical attributes of a person, or is it how they make you feel, or what you see in them, and so forth? This is kind of what he's hinting at. The age of jazz has succeeded the age of the waltz, and we now teach men to like women whose bodies are scarcely distinguishable from those of boys. They're stepping on some toes there. Since this is a kind of beauty even more transitory than most, we thus aggravate the female's chronic horror of growing old, with many excellent results, and render her less willing and less able to bear children. And that is not all. Just take a look at our culture right now and go back 100 years, and you see the idea of thinness, of skinniness, versus in the ancient world where having a larger woman would have been a sign of beauty and so forth. It would have been a sign of wealth and beauty. But then you look at how this changes within culture. You go to Asian cultures, the whiter the skin, the better. You go at Western cultures, the darker the skin. Typically, that's where we have tanning beds and tans and so forth, and we see that as part of our cultures. But notice specifically that less and less willing to bear children. 100 years ago, having 10, 12 children was the norm. Today, 2 is considered having a lot. 3 is just a ridiculous amount of kids. And we're seeing this more and more of people that are marrying and then having no children whatsoever by choice. That this happens, and we live obviously in a world where abortion on demand has become the norm, and that has become problematic. Not just problematic from the standpoint of a moral standpoint, but even beyond that, it's at a whole other level. We have engineered a great increase in the license which society allows to the representation of the apparent nude, not the real nude in art, and its exhibition on the stage or the bathing beach. It is all a fake, of course. The figures in the popular art are falsely drawn. The real women in bathing suits or tights are actually pinched in and propped up to make them appear firmer and more slender and more boyish than nature allows a full-grown woman to be. Yes, absolutely, 100%. This is 100 times more happening today than was happening even in his day. Yet at the same time, the modern world is taught to believe that it is being frank and healthy and getting back to nature. As a result, we are more and more directing the desires of men to something which does not exist, making the role of the eye in sexuality more and more important, at the same time making its demands more and more impossible. What follows you can easily forecast. That is the general strategy of the moment. But inside that framework, you will still find it possible to encourage your patient's desires in one or two directions. You will find, if you look carefully into any human's heart, that he is haunted by at least 2 imaginary women, a terrestrial and an infernal Venus, and that his desire differs qualitatively according to its object, that within him there is a desire for either something very human that he will never achieve, or something almost infernal Venus, something that is burning a passion within him on the other side. There is one type for which his desire is such as to be naturally amenable to the enemy, readily mixed with charity, readily obedient to marriage, colored all through with the golden light of reverence and naturalness which we detest. There is another type which he desires brutally, and desires to desire brutally, a type best used to draw him away from marriage altogether, but which, even within marriage, he would tend to treat as a slave, an idol, or an accomplice. His love for the first might involve what the enemy calls evil, but only accidentally. The man would wish that she was not someone else's wife, and be sorry that he could not love her lawfully. But in the second type, the felt evil is what he wants. It is that tang and the flavor which he is after. In the face, it is the visible animality, or sulkiness, or craft, or cruelty which he likes, and in the body, something quite different from what he ordinarily calls beauty, something he may even, in a sane hour, describe as ugliness, but which, by our art, can be made to play on the raw nerve of his private obsession. So here he's painting these pictures of these two types of women that could be used for their benefit along the way, and that within the mind of the man, this is what you should be trying to play out in front of him. The real use of the infernal Venus is no doubt as prostitute or mistress. But if your man is a Christian, and if he has been well trained in nonsense about irresistible and all-excusing love, he can often be induced to marry her, and that is very well worth bringing about. You will have failed as regards fornication and solitary vice, but there are other and more indirect methods of using a man's sexuality to his undoing. And by the way, they are not only efficient but delightful. The unhappiness produced is of a very lasting and exquisite kind. This last little part here, this idea of marrying, I think it speaks in some ways of marrying someone who would not be of equally yoked, someone who would be of a sensual desire for you, something that would bring out the worst in you, in the not just the sexual desires, but in life in itself, that would draw you away from God, but it would be a constant enticement because it's what you physically desired, but you found yourself in a marriage that is actually destroying you from within. So that is it. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Next week, we dive into chapters 21, 22, 23. I should say letters. They feel like chapters, but they are letters along the way. So grateful, as always, for your presence. Can't wait to see you all again next week. Look forward to being back with you. Have a wonderful week. Stay safe. We'll see you then.